Now, what we're going to be looking at in this unit, then, is first of all, kind of the creation of the Weimar Republic, its inherent instability right at the outset, which we've already kind of talked about a little bit. But then we're also going to be looking at kind of Hitler's origins, where he comes from, who he is, what his early influences are, and how those experiences then are used to fundamentally shape a political movement, the beginnings of a political movement here. So first of all, German middle class. As we know, the German middle class is wiped out economically. Excuse me. The German middle class is wiped out economically in World War I. People had been buying war bonds. They had been investing heavily, right? They've been buying the nails to make the wooden titans of Hindenburg all over the country. But they've been investing in government debt in order to fund the war, in order to fund World War I. The war ends, Germany loses, no one's getting paid back. So in 1919, all of your life savings, if you're a German, is gone. You have no money in the bank. It's gone. Now, that's important, okay? I cannot stress how much the economic factors leading toward the rise of Nazism will be. So you need to understand that, how badly that hurts the German middle class. And of course, we're going to return to the woes of the German middle class here and how that leads to the rise of Nazism. But then, of course, as we've talked about, we have the revolutions break out in Germany, and the government of the Ebert government proceeds to Weimar in the center of Germany, which is a much smaller town, which is a much safer town. You don't have a lot of communists and radicals there. And they go there in order to create this new constitution. And Friedrich Ebert, I believe as I mentioned, he chose Weimar because Weimar is a cultural center in Germany. Weimar is a cultural center in Germany. Franz Liszt, the composer, lived there. He has a house there. Goethe and Schiller, the two writers here, they both made their homes in Weimar. Schiller was actually much taller than Goethe, but the artist, the sculptor here, wanted to show they were kind of equal in ability here. Weimar is actually a great town. I think I took this picture. Weimar is a great town. Their homes are open to the public. You can go through their homes and see them. Schiller, in his house, he had this great big painting of the American Revolution, a scene from the American Revolution in his house. He really liked America a lot. But anyway, it's a beautiful little town. It's one of those towns you go to and it feels like you're stepping back, several centuries in time. Beautiful town. But it's this important cultural German city. And in selecting Weimar, Ebert is saying to the Allies, remember, Germany has contributed something to Western civilization. And we will continue to contribute to Western civilization if we are allowed to. So this was kind of a very important message that he was sending out there. Now, in many ways, this constitution that is written in Weimar is very liberal, it's very democratic, in contrast to the more authoritarian constitution of the Kaiserreich. But the president still has too much power. The Constitution gives the president too much power. The president can dismiss the Reichstag. Again, the Reichstag is the German parliament. He can dismiss the Reichstag at will. And what's more, he has a very unusual power. Now, usually in a parliamentary system, how a parliamentary system works, of course, you have the head of state and the head of government, right? If we look at England today, who is the head of state? Who's the head of state in England? King Charles III is the king. Boy, I've waited a long time to be able to say that. Right? King Charles III is the head of state in England. And the prime minister, Liz something, she is the prime minister. So she's the head of government, okay? So you've got the head of state and the head of government. Now in Germany, they create a president to be the head of state, kind of taking the place of the Kaiser, right? So the president is the head of state. And then the chancellor will be the head of government. Now, normally, how this is supposed to function in any parliamentary system is the largest political party, either a single party or a coalition of parties, they will vote to have their candidate be the chancellor, and the president would be obliged to select that person as the chancellor. However, in the Weimar Constitution, the president can select his own chancellor. It doesn't have to be the majority party. And that's going to cause some problems here later on, as we will see. So he can support a chancellor he can appoint a chancellor that is not supported by the Reichstag. But the most consequential part of this new constitution is Article 48. Article 48. Article 48 is a response to what is going on in the country at the moment this constitution is adopted, a communist insurrection. Article 48 essentially gives the president virtually unlimited power. It can make the president a virtual dictator. He can rule by decree if an emergency is declared. So if there's an emergency, they can go ahead and the president can essentially make laws without reference to the elected officials. This is a very scary thing, right? A president can just make laws without reference to elected officials. And virtually no check to his power. Now, as we're going to see, Article 48 is going to come into force toward the end of the Weimar Republic, and it is going to be a harbinger of the dictatorship the Nazis will bring. In fact, one could, I think, say a German dictatorship begins well before the Nazis come to power with the government's use of Article 48 prior to the Nazis. But we'll discuss that in a few weeks here. So let's take a look now at the German political system, okay? These are kind of the major parties right here at this time. On the far left is the communists, the KPD, okay? These are the guys that split off from the SPD. They are the far left. They're the ones that caused this insurrection right at the end of the war. But they represent the far left. Now, just to the right of them, you have the Social Democrats. Now, the Social Democrats are a center-left party. This is the SPD, okay? So we know the Social Democrats. We've been talking about them for a while. The Social Democrats are the largest political party in Germany. They're a workers' party. In theory, they're a Marxist party, but the reality is they're not. The reality is they're not. They don't believe in revolution. They believe in reform. The communists, everybody that believed in revolution, split and went to the communists. So even though the Social Democrats, in theory, still play lip service to Marx, they're in reality no longer a Marxist party. They're just a left-of-center political party. And they're the largest political party in Germany. Yeah, that's why they're kind of running the government, right? They're kind of in charge of the government, the SPD. Well, as we move to the right, now we have some center-right parties. You have the German Democratic Party, the German People's Party, and the Zentrum, the center-right party. And these are all pretty much moderate, just right-of-center parties. They're kind of like the right version of the SPD, right? They're not radical parties. They're fairly moderate. The Zentrum party, the Zentrum, the center party, the Zentrum, this is actually a Catholic party. It's predominantly a Catholic party. It's predominantly rural, and it's mostly kind of represents the south of Germany. Southern Germany tended to be Catholic. Northern Germany tended to be Protestant. Now, at the bottom here, we have the far right. And this is the German National People's Party, the DNVP. The DNVP. It supports heavy interests, the media, and it is anti-Semitic. I believe that is for the DNVP. It looks like a DNVP poster. Deutsche National. It looks like there's a brave German knight, and this kind of looks like a stab in the back theory. This looks like a vaguely anti-Semitic figure holding him while somebody's trying to... Now, of course, Treaty of Versailles, we know. Treaty of Versailles is signed in 1919. protests throughout Germany. And because the German Republic then is forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, in many Germans' minds, that makes the treaty, or rather makes the government, illegitimate. There's a refusal by many Germans to believe that the Weimar Republic is a legitimate government that legitimately represents Germans when it signed this treaty. This was a betrayal. The treaty was seen as a betrayal. How could the treaty be seen to, or how could the government be seen to represent Germans if it would do something like this, if it would betray them like this? Now, 1 year after the collapse of the army in November of 1919, Paul von Hindenburg, right, the general, the virtual military dictator of Germany in the last years of the war, Paul von Hindenburg, he's called before a parliamentary committee, a Reichstag committee. And the Reichstag committee is investigating, why did we lose the war? Why did Germany lose the war? It's just the civilian committee asking these questions, why did we lose the war? And so they bring Paul von Hindenburg forward and they ask him, why did we lose the war? And Paul von Hindenburg, who knew better, who knew that Germany had just exhausted itself, that it had exerted itself, he doesn't say that. Rather, he says Germany lost because of disloyal groups on the home front. Germany lost because of disloyal groups on the home front. And of course, immediately people are saying he's referring to, which of course he was alluding to, communists, war profiteers, and he does not mention Jews specifically, but that is the intimation. Jews were responsible. So here we have Paul von Hindenburg, who knew better, perpetuating the stab in the back theory. Right? Germany did not lose the war. We were not defeated at the home front. We were stabbed in the back by Jews and communists at home. And again, it's because the Germans just can't accept the fact that they were defeated. They just can't accept the fact that they were defeated, so we must have been cheated. The Jews, the communists, stabbed us in the back there. Inflation begins at this time. The government has to print more and more money to cover its costs, to cover its debts. And that's going to lead to more problems, and we'll discuss exactly where that goes. But this is causing serious problems. The economic issues are causing serious problems. And by early 1920, both the right and the left are hatching plots to overthrow the government, get rid of the Weimar Republic, and put in its place another government. One of these right-wing groups is led by a journalist and right-wing nationalist named Wolfgang Kapp. Wolfgang Kapp. And in March of 1920, he leads a coup against the government. And this is known as the Kapp Putsch. Putsch is the German word for coup. Okay? Putsch is the German word for coup. So Kapp leads his followers and Free Corps members. A lot of the Free Corps join him. They march into the Reichstag and they go into the Chancellor's office. As they're moving in, all the government officials see him coming and they start running away as fast as they could. So he sits down in the Chancellor's office and he essentially declares a new German government. There is a new German government and I'm in charge. But this is a right-wing government. Now remember, most German workers belong to which party? The Social Democrats, the SPD, which is the center-left party. They're not going to support an extreme right-wing takeover here. So what all these workers do around Berlin, they all go on strike. They all refuse to work. So everybody refuses just to do what they're supposed to do. So Berlin, the city of Berlin, essentially shuts down. So Kapp, even though he's in the Reichstag, people are saying they'll take his orders, nothing's getting done. Nothing's happening. He's got no real power because the people refuse to see him as legitimate. The workers in Berlin refuse to see him as legitimate. He has no popular support. After a few days, he realizes this isn't working. He flees to Sweden. He goes to Sweden. Now, this is important. During this putsch, the army did not defend the government. Now remember, when the communists were attacking the government, the army stood beside them, right? The army stood beside the government to defend it from a communist takeover. The army does not defend the government against a right-wing takeover. The army was kind of hoping this would succeed. It didn't help it, but it didn't defend it either. It didn't attack the coup. So, any questions about that? So in the aftermath of the coup, the Reichswehr has a very strained relationship with the government. Ebert comes back to his office. It's a strained relationship. But remember, the agreement still holds that the Reichswehr is still governs itself internally. The Reichswehr is the German army of the Weimar Republic, okay? The Reichswehr. Imperial defense, or realm defense. The leader, the kind of the head of the army at this time is Hans von Seeckt. Hans von Seeckt. And now remember, the Treaty of Versailles specifically said that Germany could no longer have its great general staff. Its great general staff, right? It lost all this stuff. It lost its great general staff. Well, the fact of the matter is, the army, in fact, Napoleon placed restrictions on the Prussian army, and the Prussians got around them over 100 years earlier. So they're going to do the same thing. The general staff continues in secret under a different name, the Troop Office. They just call it the Troop Office, which sounds like this administrative body. In fact, this is the Great General Staff in disguise. So the Great General Staff is allowed to continue here. The army actually, Germany actually signs a treaty with Russia called the Treaty of Rapallo. Okay? Germany signs a treaty with Russia, the Soviet Union, called the Treaty of Rapallo. And within this Treaty of Rapallo, there's a secret protocol where the German army, the Reichswehr, can actually learn and develop and train with tanks inside the Soviet Union. The Soviets are happy because they're going to get access to German technology and German doctrines about tank training, and the Germans are still going to be able to develop tank warfare. Okay? So they actually share some tactical innovation here, the Germans and the Soviets. They also agree to trade raw materials at this time, but this remains a secret. You also have more and more waves of right-wing violence. You have this minister here, Walter Rathenau. He was the head of, he was the foreign minister, the German foreign minister. He is assassinated. He was Jewish. He was a Jewish foreign minister. He'd run the war economy during the war. And he was assassinated by right-wing extremists. The people that assassinated him, I believe, were arrested and ultimately acquitted. Because the Weimar courts are notoriously soft on right-wing political violence. Very tough on left-wing political violence, very soft on right-wing political violence. So he's assassinated on 24 June 1922. Between 1919 and 1922, there were about 300 political assassinations in Germany. 1919 and 1922, 300 political assassinations in Germany. Only about 20 of them were committed by communists. Only about 20 were committed by communists. The vast majority are committed by right-wing extremists, and when they are caught, they're usually given a slap on the wrist. Now, in 1923, the French government was unhappy because Germany was not meeting its reparations payments. It wasn't paying back what it was supposed to pay back according to the Treaty of Versailles on time. It wasn't paying that back on time. And so the French and the Belgians actually kind of invade Germany. They go into the Ruhr, and at gunpoint, they demand payments of materials, coal and other raw materials, to ensure that stuff gets back. The Republic is, of course, not happy about this. It cannot physically stop the Germans, or the French rather, from occupying their territory. They're not happy. Here you can see French soldiers in Germany in this occupation. You can see the tension between the soldier and this civilian there. There were instances where there was some violence. Here you see Germans killed in the Ruhr. This is a Chicago paper. Germans killed in the Ruhr. So this is again kind of humiliating toward Germany. They can't even keep out this foreign army, which is forcibly extracting their wealth. So the Republic, they essentially decide to kind of have a more passive form of resistance. The Republic actually pays its workers, its miners, people that are employed by the government, trains, whatnot. The government pays them not to work. The government doesn't want them to work to serve the French interests, so essentially the government just kind of pays them not to work. As you can imagine, this doesn't do much to help the German economy. Paying people not to work, the French in there just kind of pillaging what they want. So things are not going well. What happens here is in order then to pay for everything, in order to pay their workers, they have to resort to just literally printing money with nothing to back it up. And of course, what do we call this? The result, what do we call it? Inflation. Right? We have inflation happens. And very quickly, by September of 1923, this evolves into hyperinflation. Hyperinflation. The existing government fell, and we get a new government under a statesman named Gustav Stresemann. Gustav Stresemann. Now, to give you an idea about this inflation, I'll talk more about Stresemann here in a second, but to give you an idea of this inflation, they were printing, like, they get to the point where they're printing like trillion mark notes. And you would go to work, and as soon as you were done with work, they would pay you so you could hurry and go to the store and buy something while your money was still worth something. Because in a few hours, it probably wouldn't be. There was a joke that there's a guy who gets off of work, and they give him just this wheelbarrow full of money. And he runs to the store as fast as he can, and he parks his wheelbarrow outside. He runs inside to see if they've got what he wants. He comes back out. All of his money is all over the floor. Somebody stole the wheelbarrow. Right? The money is worthless. An American at this time could go to Berlin, stay in the Kaiserhof or the Adolf Hotel for a week, room service, all the amenities, live like a king for like $5. The German money is worthless. It is literally, eventually, not worth the paper it's printed on. Okay? German money becomes worthless. The Adlon, incidentally, that's a hotel where Michael Jackson dangled his baby out of. You ever saw that footage? This is really, the Germans are hurting. Now, why this is significant, one of the reasons why this is significant is because we talked about at the end of World War I, the German middle class was wiped out because they had invested in the war. They had paid for war bonds, right? They were investing in the war. And then they lose the war, and all their savings wiped out. But the Germans are industrious, they're hard workers, so as soon as the war is over, they start working again. What do? They put their money in the bank, This hyperinflation wipes out their life savings again. So just a few years later, everything they worked for is gone once again. Now, it's very important, okay? Because these people, they lost everything once. A few years later, they start rebuilding. They lose everything again. So it's incredibly important to realize this as we continue looking at what's going on here with the Republic. Stresemann, he calls off the policy of passive resistance. He stops this policy of paying people not to work. Right there, that immediately helps get inflation under control. But he does something very controversial too here. You still got all these people on the payroll that have to be paid that work for the government. Well, he wants to fire them, so the government doesn't have to pay them. That'll further stabilize the economy. The problem is these guys can only be fired by an act of law because they're state employees. However, Stresemann, he knows the parties aren't going to vote for that. It would be very unpopular, all these people losing their jobs. The parties aren't going to vote for it. So what does Stresemann do? Article 48. He invokes Article 48. He declares an emergency. And through this emergency, he lays off miners and other workers, kicks them off the payroll. And this is done, these measures are done to curb inflation. But again, it's very unpopular. Because right when people are hurting economically, they're losing their jobs. Right? It helps the government stabilize the economy. So in the long term, it's a good thing. But in the short term, you're essentially firing people. So in October of 23, you actually have right-wing extremists attack the Chancellor's office. Right-wing extremists attack the Chancellor's office. But unlike during the Coups Putsch a few years earlier, this time the army defends the government. This time the army defends the government. You also have a brief communist uprising again in Hamburg that is put down largely by Freikorps. So Adolf Hitler is born in Braunau am Inn, Austria in 1889. There he is as a baby. Even Hitler was a cute baby. His father was Alois Hitler, and he was kind of a mid-level civil servant, an employee of the Austrian civil service here. And he wants his son, he has a few kids, he wants his son Adolf to follow in his footsteps. He wants, because Alois had no education. He was not formally educated, and yet he gets this good job. He's respected. He wears a uniform. He's a customs official, and he's thinking, I have no education. If my son gets an education, how far could he go? So he wants Hitler. He wants all his kids to get educations and get good government jobs. That's kind of the way he sees their life. That's kind of the way he plans it out. Now, his original name, Alois Hitler's name, last name, was Schicklgruber. That was the name he was born with, Schicklgruber. And he later has like an uncle adopt him for an inheritance. The uncle's name had various spellings. The most common was Heidler. But by the time he kind of essentially is adopted by this uncle in order to get this inheritance, the name was written as Hitler. And so that's kind of where the name comes from. Many people over the years had suggested that Alois Schicklgruber's mother, who was a servant in a home, they alleged that she worked for a Jewish family. This Jewish guy that ran the house impregnated her, and Alois was the result. Hence, Hitler was a quarter Jew. There is no evidence for this whatsoever, and in fact, the town she lived in at the time technically did not allow Jews in their borders at the time, within the city limits. So it's highly unlikely. This is kind of one of those rumors that goes around that everybody likes to say, wow, Hitler was secretly Jewish. There's no evidence whatsoever that Hitler had any Jewish ancestry. Anything's possible, but there's no evidence for it. So Alois has 2 children from his first wife. And then when Alois marries Clara Posel, which she has the same eyes that Hitler has, incidentally. When they marry, they have, I think, 3 or 4 children. I think 1 or 2 of them die in infancy. Hitler's kind of like right in the middle. Alois Hitler was very abusive. He was physically abusive. He would beat his children. He thought it was good for them. He thought it instilled character. And at the same time, his mother was very protective. She doted on him. And that's kind of a theme you see among many of the leading Nazis. Not all of them, but many of them. You have these kind of overbearing, abusive fathers, and then you have these mothers that are kind of, hovering, very protective of their children. So that is kind of basically the family dynamic there. Now, when Hitler is 14 years old, Alois has a stroke and dies. So Hitler's 14, Alois has a stroke and dies. His mother, Clara, will eventually develop cancer, and she will die a few years later when Hitler is 17. So he's an orphan, essentially. He will spend the next several years of his life in Linz, Austria, and then he'll go to Vienna, Austria. And he's kind of a bum. He kind of wastes his time. He doesn't really have steady employment. He occasionally will do paintings that he will get. A friend of his would sell for him. But he doesn't even do that consistently. He kind of is an artist, fancies himself an artist. But a real artist, a working artist, is somebody that knows when you work at your art every day, inspiration finds you. And he was kind of one of these dilettantes that just doesn't feel like creating until he's inspired, and which means he's lazy, right? And that's kind of a very important characteristic of Hitler. He is lazy. He's a lazy fellow. But he is capable of tremendous bursts of energy and dynamism when necessary. There are going to be times where he takes action and he's very decisive and very quick. But just generally, day to day, he's lazy. He's able to he stays up really late, he sleeps in, and he's kind of able to afford this lifestyle because he's an orphan. He essentially is collecting on his father's pension. His father's pension pays out, so he gets money to survive. So Hitler, of course, he has dreams of becoming a great painter. He dreams that he is going to be a great painter. This is a Hitler painting here. He dreams of becoming a great painter. And he actually, he doesn't really have the education, nor, of course, as I mentioned, does he have the work ethic to really succeed at it. He applies to the Vienna Fine Art Academy. He wants to attend the Vienna Fine Art Academy. The first time he applies, he gets very close to getting in. He was within a few points of getting in. He's very close, but he's ultimately rejected. And one of the reasons why he's rejected is he's told, yes, you can draw buildings and stuff very well, but he was told he wasn't that great at drawing people. He lost points for his inability to draw realistic people. He actually doesn't tell his friends and family he didn't get in. He keeps acting like he's waiting for it, and there's like a scene where he actually tells Kubitschek one time, he breaks down and cries and said, I didn't get in. He tries again the next year, and this time he wasn't even close. This time it was almost like an afterthought. He didn't even really try. He did much worse that second time. So as I say, his friend here is August Kubitschek. August Kubitschek. Kubitschek's chief virtue, as far as Hitler's concerned, is he was a good listener. He was a good listener. I don't think Kubitschek was a particularly dynamic young man, but he would sit there while Hitler would go on and on, talking about all his plans, talking about all these things he wanted to do, all of his art, and Kubitschek would just kind of sit there and nod. And Kubitschek was a student of music. In fact, I think he eventually becomes a composer, or not a conductor. And so Hitler, of course, really liked music, and so there was kind of an attraction there. They frequently would go to the opera together. They would go to coffee houses together. And at one point, Hitler loved the opera. He loved Wagner. And one night, I think it was after they saw Tristan and Isolde, I think, they actually, Hitler informs Kubitschek, he said, we're going to write an opera. You're going to write the music, I'm going to write the book. And it was the same thing, and of course that night he goes on and on about everything that's going to be great, but it was just pretty typical of Hitler. He's got this really big idea, and then he kind of loses interest and nothing really comes of it, right? Which is fairly typical of him. Now at this time too, another kind of interesting kind of psychological portrait we have, and I want to be very careful because we don't want to... We're historians, we're not psychoanalysts, but you kind of have to understand the guy and where he's coming from. And at this point, like most young men of his age, he's fascinated with women and sex. Okay? But he has this pathological fear of venereal disease. So we don't know if he ever actually was with women at this time, because he is really scared he's going to get some kind of a disease. He claims at this time, he would later claim at this time, that one of the things he did is this is when he started reading. He really started reading and learning and studying. And he would talk about this is kind of where his intellectual curiosity began. But the reality is he's really just reading newspapers and condensed books. He's not reading great literature. He's not really reading deep philosophy or stuff like that. It's pretty light stuff comparatively, what he is reading at this time. He's mostly reading for pleasure. And like all self-educated people, he's primarily reading stuff that just confirms his own biases. One of the great advantages of a formal education is it forces you to read things you wouldn't normally read, and it forces you to read things that are maybe contradictory to things you already believe. You're exposed to other viewpoints. Most self-educated people tend, just as I say, to read things that confirm their own biases. I'm sure there are some that don't, but for a lot of people that's the case here. Hitler does not have a real sense of humor. He's a very self-serious person, and he does not have a real sense of humor. The only kind of aspect of him that approaches humor is he does get a kick out of this of a German a word in German. There's no English translation. Scheinefreude. Scheinfreude. Does anybody know what Scheinefreude is? Has anybody heard that term before? Nobody's heard Scheinefreude? Scheinefreude is taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. Taking pleasure in the misfortune of others. So he would laugh if something bad happened to somebody else, he would laugh at them. Another thing you need to understand about Hitler is, at this point in his life, early 20s, most people begin to, in some way or another, begin to have a stake in society. Now, how do you gain a stake in society? You gain it by starting a family. If you have a family, then you're very interested in the well-being of your children. You want to work to secure the well-being for your children. That means, and of course, they get married. So people get married in their early 20s. They start families. A lot of people get an education. If you get an education, then usually that means you've got some stake in society, because you're training for something, you're getting an education, something that potentially you can make a career in. Or people are just going right to a job, to a career, right? People are starting families, getting educations, getting into careers. They're doing things to further their life. But Hitler, at this point, hasn't done any of those things. He's a bum. He's not doing any of the things that would make him want to get a stake in society, he's far too insecure and lazy to really accomplish anything with his life at this time. Here's some more paintings. A. Hitler, 1909. You can see he's got talent. I mean, he can draw buildings and scapes there. With people, as you can see, he's less. It's not bad, but it's not great. Kind of a weird-looking baby there. Well, I'll tell you this right now, I'm not an art critic myself. But looking at it, I would say it's a fine painting, but I don't think it's great. It's nothing that blows you away. So you can see with people, he's just not quite as I guess confident as he is with buildings. And indeed, at one point, he really seriously thinks he wants to be an architect, or at least he talks about being an architect. But that's something that interests him quite a bit. Now, one thing that's going on here in Austria, in Vienna, is there's a lot of politicians and powerful people who are profoundly anti-Semitic. And Hitler is heavily influenced by the anti-Semitism that is going on at this time in Austria. There's a late 19th century politician here, Georg Ritter von Schönerer. Georg Ritter von Schönerer. And he advocates a far-right ideology. He's one of these pan-Germans, right? Germany is wherever German is spoken. So he's an Austrian. He would like to see Austria unified with Germany and all these other German areas unified under a German state. And he hates the Jews. He hates the Jews. He said a Jew is a Jew whether baptized or not. Now, for a lot of kind of garden variety anti-Semites, it kind of ends if you convert, if you become a Lutheran or a Catholic or something, then you're not really Jewish anymore. But people like him are saying, no, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you convert. You're still a Jew. You're still a Jew. Schönerer had been a Catholic. He was raised Catholic, but he converts to Lutheranism. But he's not big on religion anyway himself. I mean, religion's just kind of this part of his life, but he's much more interested in politics and kind of more scientific pursuits as he saw them. But while Hitler is living in Vienna, he encounters the mayor of Vienna. That is to say, he listens to his speeches. I don't think they ever met. But the mayor of Vienna was Karl Lueger. Karl Lueger. And Karl Lueger also is a virulent anti-Semite. Karl Lueger hates the Jews as well. Although he and von Schönerer, they're rivals. They don't get along. They're not too friendly, even though they believe in a lot of the same things. One of the reasons why they clash is Lueger is a committed Catholic. Lueger is a committed Catholic, and von Schönerer, like I say, he has kind of an antipathy for religion. He's nominally a Lutheran, but he has an antipathy for religion. Lueger is critical of pan-Germanism because if you accept pan-Germanism, Austria is going to lose its independence. And he's not necessarily for Austria being subsumed in a larger German state. He's an anti-Semite too, but he's less dogmatic. Denounces Jews generally, but he still has Jewish friends. When he asks about that, how can you have Jewish friends, he gives a famous quote. And it's something that Hermann Goering is going to reiterate years later. But Karl Lueger, when he's asked why he has Jewish friends, he says famously, I decide who is Jewish. I decide who is Jewish. Like I say, years later, Hermann Goering, one of his top guys in the Luftwaffe, was Erhard Milch. And Erhard Milch, his father was Jewish. And he becomes a German field marshal in World War II. And somebody asked Goering about that, and Goering said, I decide who is Jewish. Lueger is a populist. He kind of appeals, directly to the people. He plays on their hopes and their fears. And really, you could almost say Karl Lueger, in a sense, is Hitler's first kind of political exemplar, right? Is the Hitler, in some ways, kind of models himself on the politics of Karl Lueger and how he gives speeches and how he plays to the hopes and fears of the people of Vienna there. All right, now, Hitler does not register for military service in Austria. Austrian young men were required to register for the draft, and Hitler does not do this. It's a crime. He does not register, and it's a crime. So he hears in early 1914 the police are looking for him because he failed to register. So Hitler flees across the border into Germany, and he goes to Munich. And while he's in Munich, he lives a similar kind of existence. He lives in flop houses. He occasionally paints a watercolor to sell. But he's kind of a bum. Now, after he's in Munich for a few months, the Munich police arrest him, and they take him to the Austrian consulate in Munich. And they asked, why did you not register for military service? And Hitler just kind of says, oh, it was an accident. I forgot. He just kind of, I don't know, Well, they say, okay. He acts like he doesn't understand it was required of him. So the Austrians say, okay. They do deport him back to Austria for a few weeks. The Army's doctors examine him for potentially Army service. They find he's very lean and scrawny. He's not eating well. And they say, this guy is not good material for the Army. So they declare him unfit for service. He's thrilled. He returns to Munich. Now, critically, he is not a German citizen. Okay? He's not a German citizen. But he returns to Munich. Okay, so war is declared in August 1914. We read the primary document, how thrilled he was that war is declared. He wrote, overpowered by stormy enthusiasm, I fell down on my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart for granting me the good fortune of being permitted to live at this time. There now began the greatest and most unforgettable time of my earthly existence. He joins, well, first of all, this photograph was taken by Heinrich Hoffmann. This is the Odeonplatz in Berlin. These are people cheering for the outbreak of war. And then right here is Hitler was captured in this. Heinrich Hoffmann, who took this photograph, will later become Hitler's personal photographer. And when Hitler tells him he was there, he goes back with a magnifying glass and he finds Hitler in this crowd. And this becomes a big kind of national photograph, later in the Third Reich of Hitler cheering World War I. And incidentally, Heinrich Hoffmann, one of his assistants, was Eva Braun, who will eventually become Hitler's wife. He actually goes, as soon as war is declared, he goes to a recruiter in Bavaria, and he joins Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16. Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment 16. They're so eager to get people into the army, they're not looking too closely at people's backgrounds. Because again, Hitler is not a citizen of Germany, of Bavaria. He's an Austrian citizen. They kind of don't care. They just want bodies. So they take it. So Hitler then is going to fight in World War I. Hitler will be, very quickly, he will be made a dispatch runner. A dispatch runner. Meaning he will carry messages from headquarters to the front lines, usually by motorcycle. Later, people will disparage this. They'll say, oh, he wasn't fighting in the trenches. He was he was just carrying message back and forth. It was a cushy job. In fact, couriers, this was an incredibly dangerous job. Enemy aircraft, enemy artillery spotters, snipers were always looking to take out messengers. You want to kind of cripple your command and control system of your enemy. So they're always trying to take out these guys. So this is a very dangerous job. And by all accounts, Hitler acts courageous in this war. He does participate in some of the battles in the trenches, but he's mostly running this courier duty. His regiment will be deployed shortly before the First Battle of Ypres in October of 1914. They will be present at the Battle of the Somme, which we discussed a few weeks ago, in 1916. They'll fight at Arras and Passchendaele in 1917. Not going to get into exactly what happened in all these battles, but they were all bloodbaths. These are all incredibly bloody battles that happened here. In 1914, for bravery, Hitler is awarded the Iron Cross First Class, or Iron Cross Second Class. Sorry, the Iron Cross. In 1914, he's awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. The Iron Cross is one of the highest awards for bravery, and he's awarded the second class. In 1918, he will be awarded the Iron Cross First Class, which was very uncommon for enlisted men. Usually only officers could win the Iron Cross First Class, but he was given that honor. And in fact, throughout the Third Reich, in his military coat, he always has his Iron Cross. During the course of the war, he will also be promoted to corporal, from private to corporal, so he will have some authority, and he will be wounded several times during the war. He'll be wounded several times during the war. That's him there. And I don't know if that's Fuchsel or not, but he had a dog named Fuchsel. I don't know if that one's Fuchsel, but he actually finds a dog named Fuchsel during the war. And he later loses. He's like at a train station. He lost Fuchsel. He talked about how traumatic that was because he loved the dog. And Hitler was a dog lover, right? Now, his comrades, the men that Hitler served with, they respect his bravery his reliability, but they also find him very peculiar. Very peculiar. Most of these other guys go on and on about their sexual conquests and all these things, and Hitler kind of wouldn't discuss that. Hitler was kind of tight-lipped when it came to women. The other guys in his regiment, of course, as soon as they can, they go to brothels. He would never go to brothels. Again, he has this kind of pathological fear of venereal disease. He wouldn't go to brothels. Hitler did not smoke or drink. Most of these other guys did both. And he because he's so humorless, he doesn't really make friends. He doesn't make friends. And that's kind of true of his whole life. Hitler doesn't really have true friendships. And largely because there's no give and take with Hitler, right? It's all take with him. He also, one of the things that frequently happens in every army, in every war, is soldiers complain. Right? So they complain about the food. They complain about their officers. They complain about conditions. They complain about this. They complain about that. That's a soldier's right to complain. Okay? Hitler wouldn't tolerate it. He'd get mad when the guys around him started complaining. He got mad. He thought it was unpatriotic. He thought it was defeatist. So you can imagine he's kind of probably a little tiresome. If you have to work with this guy every day, he's probably somewhat tiresome. There were a lot of German military magazines that the army would produce to kind of boost morale. He occasionally would draw pictures and illustrations and send, and they would print them. So he'd get some of his illustrations in some of these military magazines. But for all of these issues with Hitler and all these problems and his humorlessness and his failure to connect and make friends, there's one thing that this experience does. For the very first time in Hitler's life, he has a sense of purpose. He'd been a bum pretty much his whole adult life to this point. And then the war breaks out, and suddenly there's a reason for him being there. And he kind of ties up his own ego in the war. And as many people do. Well, like I said, this is the first time his life has meaning. That he's doing something important, okay, in the army here. In November of 1918, Hitler had been gassed. He'd suffered from a gas attack, and he was in the Prussian town of Passau, which was, I think, just east of Berlin. And he's recovering, and he's in a hospital, recovering from this gas attack. He is temporarily blind. Some people have suggested perhaps it was psychosomatic. Who knows? But while he is there, recovering in this hospital, he learns about the armistice. He learns about the end of the war. And he's very upset. He's very upset. So Hitler served for over 4 years. And in all that time, all those people that get killed, there was no bullet that had Hitler's name on it. There was one point where he was actually at a headquarters getting orders. He had left, and about 2 minutes after he left, that headquarters was destroyed by artillery. And stuff like that happens frequently in the war, where Hitler has all these near misses. But nothing ever actually kills him during the war. So Hitler's in the hospital. He hears about the end of the war, and he would later write in Mein Kampf, quote, "Since the day when I had stood at my mother's grave, I had not wept, but now I could not help it. And it had all been in vain. Did all this happen only so that a gang of wretched criminals could lay hands on the fatherland? The more I tried to achieve clarity on the monstrous event of this hour, the more the shame of indignation and disgrace burned my brow. What was all the pain in my eyes compared to this misery? There followed terrible days and worse nights. I knew that all was lost. In these nights, hatred grew in me, hatred for those responsible for this deed. In the days that followed, my own fate became known to me. I could not help but laugh at the thought of my own future, which only a short time before had given me such bitter concern." So as happy as he was when the war breaks out, he is miserable now at the end of the war. After the war, Hitler's got one priority. stay in the army. The army is the only, he gets 3 square meals a day. He's got a sense of purpose. He likes the army. He does not want to be demobilized. Hitler wants to stay in the army. It's the only home he's really known since he was a boy. And he needs that sense of purpose and direction. He needs it. So the army is saying, hey, we're offering classes. So he decides to take these classes to show he really wants to stay in the army. And these were largely political classes for soldiers. And the reason is because, remember, at the end of the war, toward the end of the war, you had a number of German soldiers had started reading Marx and Bolshevik literature, and so the army is trying to combat that. They're trying to give a more kind of nationalist, right-wing message to counter the Bolshevik narrative that had kind of infected the army at this point. So in these classes, Hitler starts learning about it. He gets up and he speaks, and Hitler learns he can be an effective speaker. This is kind of where Hitler discovers this talent, that he's a good public speaker. So very soon the army says, well, wait a second, we should be using this guy to teach these classes. So they start sending Hitler to different units to give speeches to encourage kind of a sense of nationalism among the various units. In August of 1919, one soldier that Hitler addressed, he said, quote, Herr Hitler especially is, I might say, a born popular speaker who, through his fanaticism and his populist style in a meeting, absolutely compels his audience to take note and share his views. So he's popular. He's popular when he's addressing these army audiences. Now, as we know, at this time, the early 20s, the stab-in-the-back myth is gaining traction. Germany didn't really lose the war. Germany was betrayed. It was stabbed in the back by Jews and communists. Well, Hitler had been reading a lot of anti-Semitic tracts for years, so people start thinking of Hitler as kind of something of an expert on Jews. They start thinking him as an expert within the army as an expert on Jews. And so officers kind of start asking him his opinion. Well, what do you think needs to happen with the Jews? And Hitler said, governments can't base Jewish policy on emotion. It has to be scientific. We have to find scientific means to essentially purge Jews, to get Jews out of German society. He's saying pogroms and persecutions like the Tsar did in Russia, that's not going to work. They never work. It's got to be a scientific, rational approach to purging Jews. He says governments should deal with Jews the way they deal with things like sanitation or public health. That's how they have to approach these questions. And in that way, we can separate Jews from German society. Now, one other thing that the army is doing at this time is after the fall of the empire, the creation of the republic, you start having like flowers in the field. All of these new political parties start popping up. And they're all over the spectrum. All these little political parties. Well, the army is looking at these because the army's thinking, should we support certain political parties? Should we support certain right-wing political parties? So they decide we need to learn what these political parties are doing. So they start sending agents to spy on these political parties. And so to that end, they actually order Hitler to attend a meeting of a political party in Munich that was called simply the German Workers' Party, the DAP, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German Workers' Party. So Hitler goes to attend a meeting of the German Workers' Party. This party program is anti-Semitic. It boasts extreme nationalism. It's anti-capitalist, and it's anti-communist. Well, he soon begins to speak up at these meetings, and instead of just spying, he starts to talk at these meetings. And people begin to listen to him. Now, the leader of the party was a man by the name of Anton Drexler. He was a metal worker, he was gay, and he is leading this party. And he's an extreme nationalist and anti-Semite. He's the leader of this party. And after Drexler hears Hitler speak, he says, quote, goodness, he's got a gob. We could use him. So soon, Hitler goes to the army, and he's reporting that this is a right-wing organization that the army would probably do well to help. And he asks for permission from the army to essentially devote himself full-time, his duties full-time, to actually helping this party grow. Helping this party grow. He believed the party could be molded into an instrument of national rejuvenation. So the army agrees. They discharge him from the army. They discharge him. They essentially say, okay, you're no longer in the army, but the understanding is he would be working for this party for the army's interests, in the army's interests. When Hitler does this in 1919, he is 30 years old. He is 30 years old. He would later boast that he entered politics at the same age that Christ started his ministry. 30 years old. A little bit of hubris there. Before long, he is appointed to be the head of the party's propaganda arm. He is the head of the party's propaganda, the propaganda chief. And he says we need to change some things up, we need to mix some things up, and he changes the name, with the permission of the Central Committee and Drexler, they change the name of the party from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis do not call themselves Nazis. They call themselves National Socialists. Hitler chooses as the symbol of the party a black swastika on a white background in a red banner. A black swastika in a white background on a red banner. Now the swastika itself was not an uncommon symbol. Many different groups had used this, of course, as an ancient Indian symbol, meaning good luck. But it had been used and appropriated by a lot of different political movements. In fact, well into World War II, I think the Finnish Air Force, this was the symbol of the Finnish Air Force. So a lot of different groups were using swastikas at the time. But the colors are important. Okay? The colors are important. The red banner is meant to appeal to people who ordinarily would go to the communists, the extreme left. Right? It's red, it's eye-catching, it's just like what the communists see. So there's kind of an appeal there to the extreme left and workers. However, the color scheme, red, white, and black, this is the colors of the German Empire, the Reich, the Second Reich. So it is a way to assure the middle classes and the upper classes that the party represents the traditional values of the Kaiserreich, of the empire. Hitler himself, wherever he goes, he carries a pistol and a bullwhip to kind of show, again, he's a man of action. Remember, fascists love the man of action. Okay, so in 1920, Hitler creates something called the 25-point program. The 25-point program. And this is the basis of the party's ideology. This is going to be the fundamental bedrock, at least in theory, of the Nazi Party. Among other things, it calls for pan-Germanism, right? This idea, Germany should be wherever Germany is spoken. It's a bedrock principle of the party here. And so that means the creation of a greater German state. The renunciation of the Versailles Treaty. We do not accept the Versailles Treaty. Germany's borders must expand. We have a growing population. We need more room. What eventually Hitler will call living room, breathing room, Lebensraum. We need more room to grow. The ostracism of Jews from German society. The ostracism of Jews from German society. And then a few things that don't sound so weird. Equality of the citizen before the law. Equality of the citizen before the law. Old age welfare expansion. Old age welfare expansion. More benefits for older people in society. An overhaul of the German education system. An overhaul of the German education system. Something I think everybody could get behind. Outlawing of child labor. Outlawing of child labor. Now, a few things that are a little kind of scary too. Greater state control of the press. Greater state control of the press. They call for freedom of religion so long as it does not conflict with the interests of the state. Freedom of religion so long as it does not conflict with the interests of the state. And greater centralization of government authority. Greater centralization of government authority. In fact, a state like Bavaria actually had quite a bit of autonomy from Berlin. So they're saying we need to have greater government authority throughout the country. Now that's not all of the 25 points, but those are some of the major points there. Any questions? Ian Kershaw is probably one of the foremost biographers of Hitler, experts on Hitler. Does anybody know Sacha Baron Cohen, the comedian Sacha Baron Cohen? He actually studied under Ian Kershaw, and he nearly became a historian of the Nazi period himself. But Ian Kershaw wrote in his biography of Hitler, he writes, quote, To the Munich public by 1921, Hitler was the NSDAP. He was its voice, its representative figure, its embodiment. Asked to name the party's chairman, perhaps even politically informed citizens might have guessed wrongly. But Hitler did not want the chairmanship. Drexler offered it to him on a number of occasions, but Hitler refused. Hitler did not want to be the leader of the party. He did not want to be the leader of the party. Why? Because he's lazy. Hitler doesn't like... If you're the leader, there's paperwork. Stuff you got to do. He doesn't want to do it. You do that. He's the de facto leader. Everybody looks at him as the leader. He doesn't want to be formally the leader and have to do all the paperwork. Okay? He has all the perks of leadership and none of the responsibility. Right? And not only that, Hitler at this time, and this is something else you need to understand, Hitler does not have an idea in his head that one day he's going to be the great leader of Germany that's going to command, he's going to be the great Fuhrer. Hitler doesn't think that. Hitler's a nobody. You know, before World War I, everybody knew who Mussolini was before World War I started. He was a fairly famous political figure and journalist. Nobody knew who Hitler was. Hitler, in fact, at this time, and I'll elaborate on this later, but Hitler doesn't see himself as the great leader. He sees himself as a kind of what he called a John the Baptist figure. He's the drummer. He's the guy preparing the way for the great German leader. But he doesn't see himself as the great German leader at this time. Okay? Now, one of the issues, too, is the party is always short on funds. The party is always short on funds. At one point, Anton Drexler and some of the other party leaders say, you know what? There's this other party. It was called the German Socialist Party, but it was a far-right party. And Drexler says, you know what? If we merge with that party, we'll be better off economically, right? We'll have more money. So he urges joining with this other party. But Hitler is scared that if they join with that party, he would lose his position and his perks. So Hitler comes out against merging with it. He says to the party leadership, if you merge with this other party, I will leave the party. I will leave this party. If they want to join us, fine, let them join us, but we're not going to merge with them. And if you do this, I'm leaving. I am leaving. So he's essentially saying you're either for me or you're for the merger, but not both. So reluctantly, Drexler knows Hitler's the draw. Hitler's what people are coming for, so he drops it. So essentially, Hitler is showing he's in charge, right? Hitler is in charge. Even if he doesn't formally have the chairmanship, he's still the guy that is running things here. So in the wake of that, finally, they say to Hitler, look, we'll do all the work, but you need to be the chairman. You need to be the leader of the party. We'll do all the paperwork. We'll handle all that, but we need you at the head of the party. So reluctantly, Hitler finally agrees to take the chairmanship of the party in late 1920. And what happens here is this is the first concept. I don't know if I've got it up here. Do it? Yeah. This is the first concept of what is known, the first time you see the concept of what is known as the Führerprinzip. The Führerprinzip. But the Führerprinzip is this idea that is established here in 1920. And the Führerprinzip literally means leadership principle. The leadership principle. The leadership principle. What the Führerprinzip means, and this will be a guiding concept. In fact, this will probably be, once Hitler's in power, firmly in power, you could argue this is the highest law among the Nazis, okay? The Führerprinzip is this idea that the leader is always right. The leader is always right. Everyone ultimately must bow to his will. You can talk to him, you can try to persuade him, but once he makes a decision, boom, the Führer is always right. The leader is always right. So what that means is any kind of committee within the party is pretty much just for show. Hitler is the one that really makes all of the decisions. By late 1923, there's so many problems. This is right when the hyperinflation is out of control, and people are unhappy with the Republic. He thinks it's time to really make a play for power. And he's going to do this by leading an armed revolution. Just like the Coups Putsch 3 years earlier in Berlin, he is going to lead a revolution, not in all of Germany, not going for Berlin. He's essentially trying to take over the state government of Munich. And the belief is if he can take over Munich, then he'll be able to the movement will gain popularity in other, kind of in northern German states, and perhaps gain power there as well. So, again, he sees himself as the drummer. That's what he refers to himself, the drummer. That's going to bring the great German leader forward. Now, as we know, Hitler is making deals. Hitler is making deals with right-wing politicians, right-wing extremists. And one person that he kind of jumps in bed with is Erich Ludendorff, okay? Erich Ludendorff, as we know, was the great general, German general of World War I. With Hindenburg, he was the virtual military dictator of Germany during World War I. Ludendorff created the Ludendorff offensives in the spring of 1918. And so Hitler and Ludendorff get together and start working together and planning to take power. Now, and if anything, Ludendorff's policies are even more extreme than Hitler. In fact, Ludendorff will eventually leave the Nazi Party and will leave his alliance with Hitler because the Nazis weren't extreme enough for him. Okay, but so Hitler and Ludendorff here are working together, and Hitler's association with Ludendorff brings him respectability. It brings him about a certain amount of respectability because most middle-class Germans respect Ludendorff. They respect Ludendorff. So by associating himself with Ludendorff, Hitler's gaining some middle-class respectability here. But he also finds another follower at this time who also brings him some middle-class respectability, and this is Hermann Goering. And of course, he's going to be one of the bigwigs. Eventually, he'll be the number 2 man in the Nazi structure, hierarchy. But Hermann Goering, he's the son of... we talked about the Goering that was the civil administrator in the German colonies during the murder of the Herreros, the genocide of the Herreros. He's his son. So Hermann Goering he comes from an upper middle class background. He's low-level nobility or something like that, but he's very respectable. He flew in the same squadron as the Red Baron. It was called von Richthofen's Flying Circus. He flew in that same squadron, and at the end of the war, he is in command of it. The Red Baron is shot down in April of 1918. By the end of the war, Goering commands the flying circus there. If memory serves, I think if I remember correctly, he was ordered to land all of his planes in France and surrender the planes to the French. And I think, if memory serves, he ordered all of his men to climb really high, bail out of the planes, and just let the planes crash, rather than hand them over to the Germans, or to the French. He, too, brings middle-class respectability, because a lot of middle-class Germans respect him, and he's able to kind of move in those circles that Hitler wasn't, because Hitler's kind of this lower-class guy. He doesn't kind of have the same manners and respectability that upper-class people do. So he kind of hitches his wagon to people like Ludendorff and Goering, who can give him access to those circles there. And it works. More middle-class people start saying, well, if Ludendorff's on board with this, and if Goering's on board with this, maybe there's something to it. Maybe there's something to it. Now, the head of the Bavarian state government, is a fellow by the name of Gustav von Kahr. And Hitler had been negotiating with Kahr Kahr is a right-wing figure. He is a figure of the political right, okay? And he had been negotiating with von Kahr to have the Nazis share some kind of power in the government. Von Kahr was making promises. Well, we'll bring in, a couple of Nazis and give them positions in the government. But Kahr doesn't trust Hitler, so he's kind of scared of Hitler and scared of this movement. At the same time, he thinks maybe he can co-opt the movement and kind of use it for his own purposes. So he's kind of making a lot of promises to Hitler that he's kind of vague on. Okay, eventually we'll do this. We'll kind of, eventually maybe we'll bring some of your guys in here. But as I say, Kahr doesn't trust him, and Hitler's kind of feeling like he's being jerking around, right? He kind of feels like this guy's making these promises, he's not serious. So Hitler starts, by the fall of 1923, Hitler starts really thinking this guy is screwing him over. Well, von Kahr makes an announcement that on the night of November 8th, 1923, he is going to hold a meeting in one of the local beer halls in Munich, and he's going to make a speech. And the beer hall, I think the hall could hold about 3,000 people. So it's a pretty big political rally. And as soon as he makes this announcement, Hitler's like, well, he's up to something. What's he up to? So Hitler is like pushing him. Okay, we need to have a meeting. We need to discuss what's going to happen. We need to discuss what's going to happen. Because Hitler's afraid he's going to do something, and Kahr's going to do something, and he's going to get left out of it. And he's tired of being left out of it, right? So Kahr kind of refuses to take his calls. He kind of puts them off. And so Hitler is kind of saying, yeah, he's using me. He's been using me because we've been in these negotiations for power, so we've been kind of going easy. I've been telling my followers to go easy on the Bavarian government. And he's using me. He's using me. So on the night of November 8th, Kahr begins to speak. And then Hitler bursts into the beer hall with a number of his followers. He raises his pistol into the air and he fires his pistol into the air. He says, "The national revolution has begun." Now, the implication is there's uprising like this all over Germany, which was not the case. It was really just this was the revolution, right? He says the beer hall is surrounded by 600 armed men, Nazi followers. The beer hall was surrounded by 600 armed men, and he says no one is allowed to leave. No one is allowed to leave. He takes von Kahr and several other leading politicians there into a back room, and he says, we need to talk. So he takes a few guys into the back room. Literally at gunpoint, he makes them agree to join him. He essentially says, you're going to join me or else. They agree. Hitler goes out, he makes a speech, and he holds up von Kahr's hand and another guy's hand. He says, we're united in this kind of new far-right government that we're going to take over here in Germany. The crowd cheers its assent. They say, oh, okay, yeah, this is a good thing. The reality was, had Hitler succeeded, it's unlikely the French would have allowed such a far-right militarist government to exist. But nevertheless, Hitler starts ordering a lot of his followers to take key buildings and key areas in the city, transportation, communication hubs. Essentially, it's a coup, right? He's trying to mount a coup here. Again, the word Putsch means coup in German, right? Hitler briefly leaves the beer hall to go to some of these places and make sure everything is going as promised. While he is gone, von Kahr and these other leaders go to Ludendorff's left in charge. Okay, Ludendorff is in charge in the beer hall. Von Kahr and these other leaders, they go to Ludendorff and they say, hey, we need to go home to tell our families we're okay. We want to get some of our belongings so that we know it's going to be a while, so we can work, and we'll be right back. And Ludendorff says, okay, I have your word as gentlemen that you'll be coming right back. Yeah, we just want to tell our families what's going on. All right, go ahead. So he lets him go. Well, Hitler comes back and he asks where they are, and Ludendorff says, oh, they went home. And he's like, what? Why did you let them go? And von Kahr says, don't worry, they've given me their word as gentlemen. They'll be back. They support us. They'll be back. But of course, rightly, they go to the proper authorities and they say, we were just held hostage. We need to put this thing down. This Hitler guy's crazy. We need to stop this thing. So by the next morning, Hitler's depressed, right? He's lost his ace in the hole, von Kahr and these other guys that he needed. And critically, by the morning, he was expecting huge crowds to show up to support him. He was expecting huge crowds to show up to support him. They don't. These crowds do not materialize. Now, some of Hitler's supporters, one of the key buildings in Munich that they took over was the army building, the army headquarters building in Munich. So they took over the army headquarters building in Munich, and now, by the morning, police have put a ring around it. So essentially the building is under siege. Ludendorff simply states, we march. We march, meaning we're going to march from the beer hall to the army building, and as we march, people will see us, they will see what we're doing, and they will come out to support us. Okay? They'll come out to support us. So on the morning of November 9, 1923, Hitler, Ludendorff, and all their followers, they leave the beer hall and they start marching toward the army building. As they're marching, a few times police units come and they block their way. Police augmented by army, they block their way. They see Ludendorff, and they get nervous. We're not, Ludendorff was this great war hero. Are we going to fire on Ludendorff? So they would scatter. These barricades would come up. They'd see it was Ludendorff, and then they'd leave. This happens 2 or 3 times. So the Nazis are feeling pretty confident. Hitler's feeling pretty confident here. They're good. They're supporting us. The people are supporting us. But then, not long before they get to the army building, another barricade appears, and they say, okay, let's march toward them. They're not going to fire on us. So they link arms. The Nazi leaders, Hitler's in the front row, Ludendorff's next to him. They link arms, and they start walking toward this barricade. Now, unlike the earlier barricades, which had just kind of dissolved, this one refuses to stand aside, and they open fire. They open fire. They kill several of Hitler's supporters. Several more are wounded. The guy right next to Hitler gets hit and pulls him down. I think it dislocated his shoulder. Hermann Goering actually got hit in the crotch. And subsequently, he'll actually be nursed to health by some Jewish women who were in the neighborhood, found him and helped him. And he will later, when the persecution of the Nazis or the Jews get really bad, he'll actually give passes for these two women to leave Germany. Hitler himself is, like I say, slightly wounded. His shoulder was, I think it was dislocated, or there was some other issue there. Pretty quickly, the Nazis scatter. They just start running in every direction. Many of them get out of the country. Many of them flee the country. One of Hitler's followers, his name is Putzi Hauptstadel. You don't need to know that right now. Putzi Hauptstadel. Hitler actually runs to his house. Putzi Hauptstadel was married to an American wife. Her name was Helen. And they were both great admirers of Hitler. So Hitler runs into this house, and Putzi wasn't home, but Helena was. And he actually is like, oh, it's all over, I'm going to go to jail. He gets depressed. He gets incredibly depressed. He pulls out a gun, and he puts it to the side of his head. Hitler is going to blow his own brains out. And Helena Hauptstadel, this American woman, talks him out of killing himself. She talks him out of killing himself. 2 days later, the police arrive, and they arrest Hitler, and he goes quietly. Hitler tries to take power by force, and he fails. He tries a revolution, an armed uprising, and it fails. And this is a critical moment in kind of the development of his worldview and his tactics, as we will see here. Hitler is put on trial. Hitler is put on trial in early 1924. February 26th to the 1st of April. During the trial, now remember, as we've talked about, these courts tend to be much more lenient on right-wing agitators than on left-wing agitators, right? And there's a lot of sympathy for him. A lot of people here have sympathy for him. During the trial, he takes responsibility for the putsch. Yes, I did it. But he remains defiant. He stated he acted only in the defense of Germany, and that he was acting against the lies being spread by Jews, communists, everybody that had stabbed Germany in the back. And he's trying to wrest control of Germany from these forces. These forces are running the country. He is trying to take it back. In fact, I think he says something like, you know, if a thief steals something from me and I steal it back, does that make me also a thief? You know, so he's kind of using rhetoric like that here. Now remember, prior to this putsch and trial, nobody outside of Bavaria knew who Hitler was. He was an extremely marginal figure in German politics. But now what happens is that putsch makes national headlines. So for the first time, people throughout the country are hearing about Hitler. Reporters flock to Munich from all over the country, and even the international press comes to cover it. So, and he gives a very impressive defense. Now he says he did it, but as I say, he's very defiant. And he's impressing a lot of people with his rhetoric, with his speeches that he's making in the courtroom. The judges aren't really shutting him down. They're letting him just go on and make these speeches. And so what he's saying is making national headlines. So people are really, for the first time throughout Germany, hearing about Hitler. They're hearing what he has to say. And to a lot of Germans, it's making sense. What he said, because a lot of those Germans still buy into the stab in the back myth about Jews and communists, you know, sabotaging the war effort. And so he's playing to that, and they're really starting to respond to that. Because of this, he's getting all of these letters from people all over Germany saying they support him. He's getting all of this stuff. And as you know, Hitler, of course, never suffered from a shortage of ego. And so this is really starting to build him up. He's got that kind of inferiority-superiority complex that are often tied together. And so his self-image, the way he views himself at this time, begins to change. Over the course of the trial, it begins to change. Now, as I mentioned before, prior to the Putsch and the trial, he viewed himself as the drummer preparing the way for the great German leader. After the trial, he starts to think, you know what? I am that German leader. I am the one that's going to change this country for the better. So his kind of worldview and his self-image really change from being somebody who was going to help usher in the era of the great leader, and he thought perhaps that great leader might be Ludendorff initially. I'm going to go from transforming that, being this transformational figure, to being the great German leader, because I've got enough support, and obviously people all over Germany love me. So as I mentioned here, these Weimar courts, very, very easy here on right-wing extremists. So there's Hitler, there's Ludendorff, there's Ernst Röhm. He was the army guy that was with him in the video. Wilhelm Frick will play a role in the first German government. They the court actually finds Ludendorff. They acquit Ludendorff. The court acquits Ludendorff of any wrongdoing. He was actually upset. He wanted to be found guilty. He wanted to be a martyr here, and he's actually kind of upset that he's acquitted. He's acquitted, and at the same time, they find Hitler guilty. And he was very upset about that, because it gives Hitler a little more gravitas. It gives Hitler a little more credibility among the right-wing extremists that he is found guilty, but Ludendorff was not. Now, Hitler's original sentence is 5 years incarceration. 5 years incarceration. Treason, he committed treason, and he gets a relatively light sentence. He's sentenced to 5 years incarceration. He was eligible for parole in 6 months. In any case, as we will see, he will, since he had already been in custody for a couple of months, in theory, he could be back on the street in just a few weeks.